Miriam, gosh, like, I sent a little, like, what do you call those things, toots or something on Mastodon, and
Uh-huh.
I just bought my little Rickenbacker Capri, and so I was really excited to have that in the background or something, be like, hey, let's have our guitars talk to each other, right? And it just didn't work out that way. So,
Yeah. Yeah, my bass is in the other room, but
oh,
yeah, we could just turn
you're
this into a jam session.
Oh, we totally could. That'd be so much fun. Like, what sort of music do you play in your groups?
I'm in a indie rock band, I guess. People compare us most to um, somewhere between Modest Mouse and Explosions in the Sky, something like
Oh no
that. I don't
way!
know. Or if they're really nice, Velvet Underground. Um,
Whoa,
it's some sort of weird indie something. I don't know.
gosh, Modest Mouse and Explosions in the Sky. That tells me, it's like some sort of almost like manic, sort of expansive, sort of a thing.
Yeah,
You know?
expansive. I would say I think of it as like we're trying to write the score for a movie that doesn't exist or something.
So do you usually come up with like some sort of like storyline in your head, or like a situation or a scenario, and then that's what you kind of put music to?
Not always, but sometimes. I mean, our new album that we're working on is specifically based on my novel, and so
That's
it
right.
definitely has a storyline, but not always. A lot of times we feel like it's easier to go from music to words than the other way around. Um,
Yes.
Otherwise, you start getting too literal with the music, and yeah.
I totally get that. And there's so many ways to approach that thing. Like some people will start with lyrics first, and they'll try to put music to that, or vice versa.
Right.
Yeah, the songwriting process I've always found to be so interesting. And I mean, it's kind of a weird pivot, but when you think about approaching a song and organizing the different pieces to it, like what does that look like compared to your approach for like web development? When it comes to like what sort of pieces do you think about putting together first? And for those of you who don't know, Miriam talks a lot about scalable CSS. And so when you talk about that, we're talking about strategically planning a lot of times, coming up front and knowing what components, what pieces we're working with. And so when we get to, when we start talking about this concept of like scaling things, well, what's the most common denominator? And then how do you scale up from there? Like what's your process look like? Yeah.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I do think um, maybe in both music and CSS, there's sort of a first and expansive approach. There's a like, what are all the pieces that we need? What are all the, I don't know, assets that we have? What are we working with? What's the material? And so there's this expansive part of the process of just generating material, figuring out what's there. And then there's a combination of whittling down. I mean, sort of, do we really need 10 different buttons? Um, or, is this pattern really going to be useful for us? And then starting to structure from there. And it's not exactly a linear process, right? Like you can't just be expansive and then just narrow that down and structure it. As you're narrowing things down and structuring, you see what you're missing, you see what can be thrown out. I feel the same way for writing or making theater or sort of any creative process. And I think CSS and design, of course. Um, but yeah, the work that we do is often creative and goes through a similar set of steps and iterations on those things.
Well, that's interesting too, because it used to be back in the day. Well, it's still a lot of times today, maybe even more so. That we like to have a baseline, some sort of base that says this is our starting framework of things, our boilerplates. That used to be the like big thing. What's your boilerplate?
Oh,
Um,
right.
but but one video of yours that I come back to oftentimes is the one you did for the W3C in terms of talking about all the different sources that CSS can come in, from because we're not dealing with, a print medium where we know what the conditions are up front. We have styles coming in from multiple places, whether it's the user agent, the user themselves, our styles, external vendor styles. Is it possible to do that sort of, boilerplate thing, or are there baseline things, or is there like no one size fits all anymore in the modern web?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I find it hard to have boilerplate, but also there are things that I sort of reach for over and over. And often it's more just like I know these patterns and I come back to them. Um, I know I know an approach to solving a problem and I come back to that. I remember, when I was first really diving into this, I mean, I had been doing some web development in like early 2000s, but around 2008 was when all the frameworks started coming out. There were so many frameworks, um, the Blueprint and 960GS, and all sorts of these. Uh, it was sort of the first time that people were sharing CSS libraries and using them across projects. And I saw a talk by uh, Natalie Down, that was called CSS Systems. And she was like, these frameworks are getting in the way. They're locking us into one solution over and over that doesn't fit our projects, and is making things more bloated, is solving problems worse. And she suggested instead we should have systems of CSS, which is that sort of like small bits of repeatable idea that we can come back to, and we can say, well, yeah, I need this pattern again. I need this little bit. I don't need the big framework. I don't need it to tell me exactly what my components are. It doesn't know what my components are. It doesn't know my constraints. But having these like snippets of an idea that I can pull in and apply to my own context, and adapt. And I really liked that idea. It fits the way I think, at least. A sort of like, yeah, we come back to motifs, but the context is unique, and we have to adapt our motifs to that context or something like that.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, as you're talking about, like, oh, this was the first time people were really sharing CSS. Like I got super nostalgic about all that.
Yeah, yeah.
It was such a
Eric
good
Meyer's
time. I
reset.
mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's actually another interesting way to think about scalable CSS is like all the resets and the reboots or whatever you want to call them. Like I've started seeing that there's now personalized resets throughout
Mhm.
CSS because we've had so many more features with different ways to select things and different features that we need to account for. What might have been in a traditional CSS, like Eric or Nicholas's or anyone's like that that we're not going to see like today, but maybe we'll see something else in there today. What sort of things go into your reset these days as you're thinking about scalable CSS?
Yeah, I do have a short snippet that I like, at least when I'm creating a small project, I just at CSS tab and I get my little uh just a keyboard shortcut that I wrote to get my little starting project. But it sets up a couple layers for me. Um, there's in the reset layer, there's the um, the universal selector to give me box sizing, um, of border box on everything. And
That will
I
never
think
go away, will it?
yeah, no, that's with us forever now. Um, I think there's minor adjustments to setting a height on HTML of 100% and a min height on body of 100%. So I'm using the full screen, and I can decide whether I actually need to do anything with that, but it's in there. It's not hurting anything. Um, and yeah, a few little things on like, you know, inputs inheriting the font, um, and some niceties like that. But it's pretty small. It's 15 or 20 lines of CSS, just a few little things that I'm like, this is where I like to start, and then I'll build from there. It doesn't feel like we're doing the sort of thing where um, I'm not removing a lot of styles. I'm not trying to get browsers to act the same. They already do. Um, but just trying to clean up a few things that bug me every time.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that just earlier this morning when I was working on a little demo. And of course, you usually have short content in a demo, and so your body, isn't necessarily going to naturally grow the whole,
Right,
viewport height. And so
exactly.
it's like always a decision for me. I'm like, do I just use 100 viewport height since it doesn't really matter. It's going to be no scroll anyway, or do I just say 100%, or yeah, that sort of thing. So I can see how
Yeah,
how that would come in handy as being, just like a reset thing that you don't have to think about ever again.
yeah, exactly.
No, I now I gosh, in the 1 year that like I wasn't writing heavily about
Uh-huh.
CSS, um, gosh, dang, so much happened. and and I was like, boy, this was the worst year to not write about CSS at all. Now, like just for like my benefit, as far and for others here who are listening in, can you just like high level summarize, like in terms of excitement level, where you are with some of the things that about just in the last few months, even that like we're starting to see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm having trouble tracking what's at what stage, and um, but I I think I just was working on a side project yesterday, um, and the thing that was really making me happy was having color mix and OKLCH colors, um, and being able to put none as a channel value in a color, and then like mix with none on one side. And if you do that, you get rid of the problems of, so if you're combining two colors, you're mixing two colors, and they each have, their L, their C, and their H channels, lightness, chroma, and hue. We get the sort of average between each of those channels. So the color that we get out is we just take those numbers, we put them together, we average them, and we get the result. If one of those is none, it becomes the same as the other channel. So if this is none, it just sort of goes away and we keep that channel. So mixing with none, we can be like, okay, keep the chroma whatever it is, keep the hue whatever it is, just change the lightness. Or we can say, we can pick which ones that we want to keep and pick which ones we want to mix. And they're sort of imaginary colors, right? An OKLCH of none, 100% none, is not a color, but it's this placeholder that can tell us what exactly we want to be interpolating with to get a result. So I've been having a lot of fun with these new color spaces and color functions. Uh,
I
I think
I
that's
feel
so
like you could
cool.
you could you could probably just talk about colors all day long. I mean, that alone has seen such a shift in the last year. I mean, syntax
Yeah,
changes, everything. It's a
yeah.
whole different model. It's like relearning and speaking almost new. It's making us a little smarter about colors in general because I've had to start like learning concepts and terms of things I thought I would never understand.
Well, I
uh,
find that interesting about a lot of the features that are coming out. It's like layers are making us really learn the cascade and understand what all else is happening in the cascade. And I mean, some people are frustrated with how importance works in layers, and that's fair. It works differently than maybe what you thought of before, but it works the way it works everywhere else in the cascade. And I think it's useful that we have to learn that now. We have to be like, oh, that's what importance is. That's different from how I understood it. And now we have to do the same thing with color. We have to understand color models a little bit differently because we have more than one of them. Um, which, we've had more than one color format, but all all built on the same model and all built on the same gamut. And now we have color formats that are on different models and on different gamuts, and that's we have to start to figure it out.
Yeah, it's mind bendy, right? Because some of these things don't translate across gamuts or spaces, right?
Right.
Because you might see some like oaklich or what that's the way I say it in my head. I don't know. Uh, you know, you might have a space that's covered here, but that isn't covered in like an RGB space, and so you don't have this one-to-one in your fallback color. You know, could be a little different just depending on what space you're working with. Like, has that been a situation that you've come in or come across often?
Yeah, so I think there's a little bit of a problem with the way that browsers shipped these new color spaces where so there's an interesting thing when you're dealing with when you're creating a color space, and I mean color is fake, we made it up. Um, so we create these things. We say, okay, here's a way that I want to represent color, and here's a way that I want to move through colors. Usually in 3D space, we create a coordinate system, and we can say the X, Y, and the Z. As I move around this space, what colors do I get? And we do that sort of sometimes in cylinders, where we have a hue that gives us degrees around the circle, and then lightness and saturation give us, in and out or up and down. But we're moving around in 3D space, or RGB is cubic, and we're moving just XYZ coordinates in a linear space. So we've got these different ways of doing it. But um, you have two choices to make. So if you want it to have clean edges, like HSL is a cylinder with clean edges. But to get clean edges, you have to like stretch the yellows out and stretch the blues out here, stretch the yellows here, and condense things here. And you sort of have to push colors closer or farther from each other to get that clean edge. And the nice thing about the clean edge is you know when you're getting to the boundary. You get to 100%, you're at the edge. So that's great. You know you're never going outside of the space. Uh, but if you want the colors to be evenly spaced perceptually, so a change of 5 lightness always looks like a change of 5 lightness, you have to you don't get clean edges on your space. So you've got this funky looking space. It's sort of a diamond. You lose a lot of saturation towards black and towards white, but colors aren't even like, yellows come out at the top and blues come out at the bottom and magenta is sort of sticking out in the middle. And so when you try to move around that, you don't know where the edges are. And so you can really easily go outside. And this is one of the features of the like OKLCH space is that it's perceptually uniform, which means it's not spatially uniform. Um, and browsers ship that without shipping any way to help bring you back in. Uh, and so I've been really frustrated with that it's easy to go outside of these spaces now, and it's hard to get back into them. And it was one of the things that we talked about a lot at the working group meetings in Spain last week, is how are we going to fix that? And I think we have a solution that's decent. Browsers are happy because it's fast, and I'm happy because it gets you fairly close to what you want, a lot better than what we have now. Right now, if you go too far out, you can end up at a completely different color. It converts to RGB and then it just clips. It just says, okay, anything above 1 or below 0, cut it off. And you can just totally change what a color looks like that way. Um, so they've got a new proposal that sort of does a smarter bringing you in to Rec 2020, which is one of the biggest gamuts that we could even conceivably put on a monitor. There are no Rec 2020 monitors yet, but conceivably we could have Rec 2020 monitors. This would work to get you there, and then we only clip if we have to after that, and it works a lot better. So I would be careful playing with OKLCH until that ships. Right now, it's got some weird edges, but I'm glad we have a solution.
This whole like way that you've described going in and out of a zone and how to neatly get like conformity versus true, like, you know, like consistent light or perpetual light, in there. Like that makes more sense than than so many of the other things I've read. Oh, because you can actually imagine these shapes being stretched and contorted in such ways just to make it bend to our wills. But then we might let one of these new color spaces just naturally do what it does, and then accept that for the sake of getting consistent lightness throughout.
Right,
But
right.
that also leads to the complexity or the convertibility issues, which especially when it comes to things like you're talking about color mix and things like that, it's going to be very difficult to mix certain colors if the spaces aren't really compatible
Yeah, yeah,
between each
because
other.
you mix from this bright fuchsia to this blue, and you go outside of the space to get between them. And then, if the browser isn't smart about helping pull you back in, you're going to be in trouble. You're out in no fake color world. I mean, it really is fascinating. OKLCH can represent not only colors that exist but aren't on your monitor, but it can represent colors that just don't exist. They're just not colors. There's no physical representation of that color. It's just math. At this point, we're just doing math. And you can
Is
get there.
is this getting into quantum physics now? We're like, are we in this very specific space, or are we in both spaces at once?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just gonna say that that's a good parallel.
Great.
No, it really is though. You're working in a whole different dimension in space, and you kind of have to put yourself in that context to even understand it. Like almost put boots to the ground in that area in
Right,
your imagination, and be like, okay, like why isn't this working? Well, we're in a different structure with different walls and a different ceiling, and
right.
yeah, like sometimes we're gonna have to go out the front door, to go mix with another color or something. That's really cool. I just never really heard it explained like that. I really appreciate that. I think that's awesome.
Good.
Uh, one thing you mentioned that I think, I had this on my radar just to ask in general is that where what folks may not know about you, if they, if they're new to you and your name, is that you do participate on the CSS working group, and that to me is such a fascinating organization or like collective, because yeah, it happens out in the open. You can go see any discussion that's going on in GitHub. Just pull up any issue. We can file issues. We can be as transparent or as engaged or as unengaged as we really want. But there still seems to be like a shroud of mystery around it in some ways. And I think that's largely our own doing, right? Because we don't participate as closely as we could. But
Yeah, I
but
don't know.
what
I
does
mean,
it
I'd be
look
happy
like?
to blame the working group. I don't know. I don't feel like I I feel like maybe the working group should be doing more outreach. Like I didn't really know much about the working group before I was invited to join it. So that does feel like some sort of secret society, and I don't think it should feel that way, right? But I do like that, and moving to a totally open process on GitHub. I think that was fairly recent, and by fairly recent, I mean 8 years or something. Like it's been a while, but it's not been the entire history of the web. I mean, it was a lot of it was handled on email groups before that you could get involved with. But yeah, it's the group that figures out what CSS should be and how to fix old things and how to create new things, and it is all public. It's all on GitHub. CSSWG-drafts is the repo where we have all of our specifications for CSS and have all the issues. And there are so many issues. I mean, it is drowning in issues. But so yeah, you can file something, and you should know that it might take a while for somebody to see it and get back to you, but we will. Uh, and if there's somebody that is working on that spec, it's fine to ping them, mention their handle in GitHub or something, get their attention. All the specs have the editors of that spec listed at the top of the spec, so you can see like these are the people that are actively maintaining this specification. So you can reach out to them if you've got specific issues that you think they should look at. Um, but yeah, I would happily say that as the working group, we should be doing more to make sure people know about it and make sure people know how they can get involved. And often the way that people end up, well, there's two ways that you end up on the group. Um, One is you work at a company that is a member of the W3C, and then they can send anyone they want. So, Google and Apple and Mozilla all have people in the group, and Adobe has people in the group, and Microsoft has people in the group. And so all these companies that have some stake in the W3C send a few people. And then the other way you end up there is you participate on GitHub or in other channels, and somebody says, you keep having good ideas. Do you want to just come to the meetings? And then the sad thing about that way of getting in is that then you don't have a paycheck. You just have more responsibilities. So that's the way I got in. And
You were just a glutton for punishment, right?
yeah, well, I guess so. I mean, I was working on this series of videos with Jen Simmons back at Mozilla back in 2019. And I was making a series on the Cascade, teaching the whole Cascade. And Jen kept pushing me to be like, well, what could be better about the Cascade? Um, and so I sort of wrote out this like, okay, here's what I think could be better about the Cascade. And she really kept pushing me to post it to the GitHub. Um, and I did, and now we have Cascade layers. So,
And I
and
thank you
I
for it.
didn't, oh, good. I didn't have it worked out. I mean, I was just like, we need something that gives us some more explicit controls, because all we have is heuristics. All we have is these like subtle controls. What if we had an explicit control? Um, so yeah, we do now.
It's phenomenal, and I do want to talk specifically about cascade layers because there are some fascinating things about it that may be like under the radar as far as like the big overviews and introductions of what it is. But there are a couple of other things about the CSS working group that I think are might be interesting, and one is,
Okay.
well, I would like to know what a meeting looks like, or like, because there's going to be a face to face coming up soon, right? Like
Well,
a
it
live
was
sort
last
of a
week.
deal.
It was
Oh, it
last
was last
week.
week. Okay, I
Yeah.
totally missed that. But that's like is that part of what you think an outreach effort looks like?
Well, the face-to-face is still just the members of the group. So I don't know that it works great as outreach, although we did a panel at a university in Spain. So that was a lot of fun. Uh, Sitting and talking to college students about what the working group is, what we do. And so there was some outreach that happened while we're there. And there's a lot of, a lot of us are active on Mastodon or whatever and are posting as the group meetings are happening, we're posting what's happening and we're getting feedback and we're pointing people to issues. Like we're about to discuss this. Go check out that issue and leave comments if you have thoughts. So there is some outreach that happens while we're there, but it's 3 days of 8-hour meetings with, you know, uh, they're always hybrid now. Um, so it's like 20 of us in the room or 20 or 25 in the room, and then another 20 or 25 coming in and out virtually. And yeah, we're just going through that backlog of issues, trying to find answers to sometimes really really current questions. I mean, like we've been spending a lot of time on these color issues and on anchor positioning and some of these new features that are very that are in the midst of their hype. um, so some of the discussions are around those and working out the details, and then some are much more obscure, just like we found this weird edge case with floats, and we just it doesn't matter which answer we choose in a lot of ways, but we need to choose an answer. We need to all agree on how it should work when you have a zero width float. Do things get pushed to the edge of the float if they would overlap it? And you're like, wow, I don't know. But then, somebody is really deep in that and will give you all the implications. Okay, if we go this route, it means Uh, and so, yeah, it's a strange mix. And, I'm there with like I've got 3 or 4 specs that I'm an editor on, and a few other issues that I'm paying close attention to, and then a lot of stuff that I'm just sort of I'm like I'm as new to it as you are, and but I'm sitting there and sometimes have input. Often I'm just listening, and uh, I don't have a strong opinion on how we handle zero with floats. But it's a fascinating discussion. The first call that I was ever on, they were discussing what is the size of a box that doesn't render, and I thought this is some Zen shit. I don't I don't know. And I don't remember what answer they came to. Um, like it's either zero or null or the size that it would be if it rendered. Um, but
So is that part of the discussion I've seen with the ability to animate from a zero to an auto height of sorts, where it's like, is this thing actually rendered, first before we even consider it a zero
right,
height? Is that
right.
part
I
of it?
mean, that might be, I mean, that's why you would need starting style, the new at rule that lets you say like yeah, how is it styled before it renders? And then transition to how you want it styled now. Yeah, it's probably related. I don't remember. I think it was specifically they were trying to work that out. And this is often true where like you work out a problem for one reason and then 10 years later you find out it had implications on something else, right? Um, so I think at the time it was just like we have a JavaScript API to return the size of a thing. If we're not rendering the thing, what do we return? So it was a more like practical, just like we have to have an answer. This JavaScript API has to return some value. What value should it return? And often it's like browsers are doing something because they had to when they shipped. But when it comes up to the group is often when they're doing different things. One browser is doing one thing and another browser did something else. And that was true with floats, right? Like we've had floats for 20 years. Browsers had already answered these questions. They just answered them differently. And that was the problem. So we just wanted to get everybody on the same page about what you do with zero with floats.
Which is where interop becomes a big deal for you, right? Being
Right,
able to say, hey, we're codifying these things. Now we need to make sure that you're following the standards in them and not
right.
just going off of your old assumptions of things, right?
Right. And to some extent, it's the older a feature is, the more likely it has those problems to some extent. Because CSS2 was not focused on defining the edge cases. It was very much about just sort of saying ideally what will happen, and then we'll let browsers figure out the rest. And modern specs are a bit more detailed about like, here are all the ways we expect this to go wrong, and here's how to handle that.
Here's where the crap will hit the fan, and
Yes, exactly.
just shield yourself in advance, please.
Exactly. Yeah. And let's make sure we all agree on what the shield is so that if we go too long with one browser having a different answer than the other browsers, we can end up with people relying on those bugs. And then, it's like, well, we don't have a choice anymore. We have to do what Chrome did because too many people are relying on the Chrome bug. Um, and okay, now we have to just go with it.
Or that vendor prefix property or whatever,
Right.
we
Yeah,
have to go
right.
with those because
Exactly.
now everyone's using that for scroll bars or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a
Oh, it's
strong
so
don't break the
interesting.
web vibe whenever possible. There's times that we break that rule, but yeah.
Oh, yeah, you can't be dogmatic about a thing and
Yeah.
say, well, just have to say no to everything. And that's actually that leads to one of the other questions I wanted to ask about with the CSS working group is I remember a post that Chris Boyer wrote, many years ago. It was probably a few years after starting CodePen, and it was this idea of like feature requests, right? People ask like, oh, can't you just do this or just
Hmm.
do this? Because it just sounds so easy. And then he goes through like, well, here are all the considerations that you have to go through, with a system or a platform, whatever. And that's
Right.
just CodePen. That's one website, that's conforming to a thing. What about the whole internet and what it does? And someone
Yeah.
asking, well, can't CSS just do this because it sounds
Hmm.
easy? But what have you learned thing on the CSS working group that it's not as easy, or maybe it is, or maybe there's some other roadblock that's making it difficult. Like what does it look like to consider a feature request at the working group?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different aspects to it that that change depending on what sort of feature you're talking about. I mean, there's some things that we have built into the structure, like every feature is supposed to go through. There's groups at the W3C that are supposed to do review of internationalization, security, accessibility. We're supposed to get these reviews on every spec so that we know, like, the internationalization people tell us, yes, that will work for multilingual websites and automatic translation and, et cetera. So there's these built-in processes for trying to get that, I don't remember what they call it, horizontal review between groups. But then there's just lots of other stuff that's like, we have to think, how does this thing behave in the cascade? And there's lots of little pieces to that. If we're creating a shorthand, it has to only combine things that make sense cascading together. Does it make sense that when we set these values, they should stay together as a unit? And if we
Oh,
override that
background.
shorthand,
Ooh.
yeah, and if we override that shorthand, they all get reset. Um, so, okay, does it make sense that these things are cascading together in this way? When exactly should we use inheritance? I mean, I would say it's really only a fraction of CSS that inherits by default, right? We think of it as a core piece of, and it is a core piece of the functionality of CSS, but it's not most properties. It's really limited to a lot of typography stuff because text just flows right through those elements. And so it's hard to be like, we're gonna reset the color of your text every time you add a span. Like that's just not gonna work, right? So we need inheritance to let text flow through and have the styles that are styling that text also flow through. But then it would be terrible if background's inherited by default, and every time you added a span, you got your background image now again in this time. Like you don't want that sort of things that apply to the box probably don't inherit. Things that apply to the text probably do. But that's not 100% rule. That's like sort of the rough rule of thumb. And then but yeah, you have to think through all of these. And then CSS is also, in a lot of cases, modal, where like you change display from grid to flex to block, and it can change what other properties do. Um, so you have to be thinking too about like, does this behave differently in different modes? If we're in a different layout mode, does that change what this property does? Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. There's just
Oh,
like so
totally
many
does.
layers of
Yeah.
this.
There's too many cascading layers for all this, right? Yeah. I mean, seriously, I mean, when you talk about how the web behaves, or actually, well, CSS is getting more and more into interaction and preferences and things like that, but
Hmm.
also just how it presents, how it
Right,
renders. It there's too many factors to consider when you think about, how many websites there are out there and what sort of different strategies
right.
they're using, and we have to stay backwards compatible as best as possible, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a huge challenge. Now, in that scheme of things, now the HTML group is a whole different group than CSS, right? And so, how do these two work together when they're like so intertwined that you can't really divorce one from the other? Like, is there a good working rapport there? Like, what does that look like to collaborate between groups?
I would say it's rough. I mean, and not like personally, not like we're in fights or something, but we have really different sets of processes. And there's, I don't think there's a good bridge between them right now. I would love to see a better bridge between our processes. The CSS working group deals with modules. So colors is a module and it can update at a different speed than grid, which is a different module. And they're not attached to each other, and each one has its versions. So, we'll put a new feature in a new version, and then we'll get that version to rec, which means it's pretty solid and it's in all the browsers and it works fairly consistently. So, we're working these different modules at different speeds through a versioned system. And the advantages of that, I mean, I think are fairly clear to anyone who's done agile development, or I'm using that as a lowercase term, iterations and having more of a modular design and being able to move things at different speeds. The downside of it is we sometimes have spec fiction. There's a new spec that says a thing and browsers never implement it. And that spec is just sitting there for a couple of years wrong, because we tried to define it and browsers didn't go for it. So there's a way that we get out ahead of browsers. The HTML working group avoids that by saying it's all one thing and it's always the same level, and we just accept PRs, but only once a browser has implemented. So it's never fiction. But then it's hard to match those processes. Like how do we get a feature? I mean, so you sort of have to work on it in CSS and then get a browser to start prototyping it and then take it over to the HTML group, but then there's feedback. These processes don't line up perfectly. And I think there's work to do sorting out that relationship. But yeah, I mean, we meet with them fairly regularly, and that's friendly. And we're starting to meet with them more. I think there's a new like every other week meeting that's been set up. It used to be more like every quarter or something. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
there's
So,
interest in improving that, but
oh yeah, like I mean, we would just imagine that CSS and HTML work together so naturally. From a technological standpoint, we just maybe assume that the standards live that way too. But this is why we call CSS these like these modules, this like candidate recommendation, this sorts of things. Whereas
mhm.
in HTML we have this living standard, right? That's why they
Yeah,
call it. It's living, it's breathing, it's always it's a little amorphous in some ways. Is
right.
that right? Yeah,
Yeah.
I,
And I would say, I
find
mean,
that
they're
really
both
interesting.
amorphous in different ways, yeah, but they're very different sort of philosophies on how you spec. And I think I mean, I think, neither one is right, but there's maybe some balance in the middle that we can find where we have less fiction on the CSS side and a bit more flexibility on the HTML side, and maybe there's something we can find there. But yeah, I think it's interesting. And I mean,
Well,
I also at this point the three main web languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, are maintained by entirely separate organizations. So HTML is maintained by the WhatWG. They are not part of the W3C, although they do come to like TPAC, the W3C conference. So they interact with us quite a bit, but they're not technically in the W3C. The W3C maintains CSS, and then TC39 maintains JavaScript, and that's also a separate organization. So um, they're not maintained by the same, even conceptually different groups in the same organization. They're totally separate organizations running these three
isn't this
languages.
this is fascinating? That
Yeah, it's weird.
this is how the web gets built, folks. Like this
Right.
is
Well,
nuts.
and to be
Yeah,
fair, it is a lot of the same people. Like Google is sending the same people to some of the WhatWG meetings, the CSS meetings, and the TC39 meetings. So, each browser engine has their people going to all three. So they're not totally separate. They're not like, but yeah, it's a weird structure.
now you might have information on this. You might not, just because I know that you're part of the CSS working group. That doesn't mean you're necessarily on all areas of the groups. You're in certain modules. But I've been hearing like these whispers of like CSS reconsidering its versioning again, and this whole concept of CSS next or something like that. Like
Oh,
do
so
you have any context on that?
yeah, so this is a little bit separate from the specifications themselves. So the specifications would continue to work the way that they are, and this is really an outreach idea. This is how do we talk about what features have landed? And I think there are sort of two approaches to this. One is the baseline work that's coming out of uh, maybe these are both coming out of the same community group. But one is the baseline idea is we track a date when this is now broadly supported or it's supported in all the browsers, and we call that the keystone date for a feature. So the keystone date for colors was sometime earlier this year for this new color functions, right? That it shipped in all the browsers. We put a keystone date on it and we say this is now newly available. And then we wait 30 months, which I don't know exactly how people came up with that number, but they said, okay, 30 months is roughly when we can say this is supported in 90% of browsers. And, Adrian, who I think is here, has pointed out that browsers and screen readers are different animals. And so when something reaches baseline uh, in browsers, that doesn't mean that it's got accessibility support always. So we've got to look at that too. But so baseline is this one approach that says feature by feature, we're gonna track when did it become available and when is it broadly supported. And then the other approach is this numbering of grouping of CSS features to say, sure, okay, but a bunch of these features came out around the same time. They have a similar sort of keystone date where they launched in browsers. Let's call that CSS4. And then we can refer to groups of features by these levels. And I think it'll be interesting to see how useful that is. I mean, clearly it was useful with CSS3, and that was a long time ago. Um, but it was a way of selling a feature set, selling learning these new tools. It was a way of saying, people put it in job listings. They would say you should know the CSS3 features. So I think that's a little bit of the goal. Is like, can we wrap up everything that happened in the last 5 years and call it CSS5 and uh, make sure that people learn CSS5? Um,
That's so interesting to me because gosh, we have different ways of like referring to these things, and I still think of like CSS3 as like, oh, box shadows, oh, border
yeah.
radius, oh, I still think of these things. Um, and obviously, that was like a good branding or like a good way to like publicize. And I still see CSS3 and HTML5 referenced in job postings for some reason, but that is still a thing, and that makes a lot of sense in how to talk about these things.
Hmm.
Now, I wanted to make sure I honored my promise about talking about cascade layers
Okay.
because like I I use cascade layers daily now. Like that's just the thing for me. I always have to have some sort of base layer. I have to have some sort of like presentation layer, and then I do this
Hmm.
all the time in CodePen, right? Because then I just have a demo layer, where it's like that's
Yep.
what's
Same.
gonna supersede. Yeah, exactly, and
Yeah,
that's
or
like
I mean, lately
so
I've been
handy.
leaving off the demo layer because I'm like the
Yeah, that's
unlayered
right.
styles win, so
That's
that's my
yeah,
demo is unlayered styles, and I don't need a
yeah.
special layer for it. But yeah.
It's it's very elegant. I love that. And now now the thing that I find to be really hard to wrap my head around, and this is going back in time to what we were discussing a little
Hmm.
bit with important, but the important keyword like flips everything, but and like Mario becomes Wario and everything. You're in this like
Yeah, yeah,
Bizarro
yeah,
world
yeah.
or something
Yeah,
can
yeah.
you
Spock
explain what
grows a
happens there? Because
goatee and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But like
Um,
what conceptually happens there? Because it is I think that's hard to articulate for some people.
yeah, so have you ever played a game where like you're like you have to go around the circle picking things, but to make it fair, you go around the circle one way and then you go back around the circle. So the person at the end gets to pick twice, and the person at the beginning picks last. like they pick first and last. That's the system. Um, Sometimes referred to as like a snake draft, if you're talking about like drafting in sports or something. But that's how the cascade, that's how importance was invented. Importance was invented initially for, there's three origins in CSS, three places a style sheet can come from. One is from the document. That's us, often called the author origin, but it's styles that are attached directly to the document. They're specific to the document. But we're not first or last in this draft. Um, so first, the browser applies browser defaults. And without browser defaults, you can remove them. If you say all, you select everything and you say all initial important, that will reset the browser defaults. You'll lose all of them and the page will become unreadable. It's just a block of text because by default, everything is inline. By default, it's all just black inline text and that's it. Um, and so browsers are providing all these defaults that make a site readable by default. And then users can apply their preferences. And initially the idea was they would apply a style sheet like the browser or like us. That's less and less common. But when users are changing a UI in their browser, that's basically just a fancy way of writing a style sheet, right? It's just a graphic interface for writing a style sheet. They even, some of them will have a like, allow this to be overridden or don't allow it to be overridden, little checkbox, and that is importance. The users are implying them, they're applying importance when they do that. They're just, that little checkbox is bang important. Um, and what happens is the browser goes first, it applies defaults, and then the user's preferences apply, and then we go last. Uh, and we get to override everybody unless they've hit important. And if there's importance on any of their styles, they jump over us and we go back through the list. So first our important layer, and then the user's important, and then the browser's important. And browsers do use importance. If you look at the browser style sheets, there's several places where they have bang important in there, and it's just places we're not allowed to go. We're not allowed to go there. And you can think of it as just like it's not allowed, but the way that it's not allowed is browsers add important. Um, and so that's the idea is we go last by default, but then when it comes to important things, we go first and the user and browser can override us. So it's this balance of power. Importance is there to balance the power between these concerns. And it's really for lower layers, less important layers, to say, look, I may not have that much cascade priority by default, but this is something I care about. And you can't just stomp all over it. You have to let me have this one. And that's what it's for. It's to protect from future styles that may try to override something that is essential. And so we wanted to keep that behavior in Cascade Layer so it works the same way. So, and it's useful for something like you've got a reset, but if you've got something that is essential in your reset, sure, your reset by default, you want it to be the lowest layers, you want to override it easily, but you've got something in there that really is essential, put importance on it, and it will win over the future layers. That's what importance is for. And it's a rethinking of what importance is for. We have to get used to it, but it's from the spec perspective, it's the way it always was. This is just
Yeah, yeah, traditionally it's been something that like we just see as an author side tool, right? You know, it's our own battles within our, you know, the
right.
the
We've been
styles that
fighting
we
each other
declare.
and we've been putting it on the thing that we think is the highest layer. And what we really need to do is rethink that and be like, no,
Yeah.
this is goes on the lowest layer to protect ourselves from higher layers. When something needs to be protected, that's when we use it. If we're trying to override something previous, we should use layers to do that. If we're trying to protect from something that might come down the road later, that's what importance is for.
and that's a defensive mechanism of sorts, where
Right.
it's like that
Yeah,
that becomes a useful tool because we're protecting it from another origin, as opposed
exactly.
to battling ourselves. And now we have so many different tools for managing Cascade between relation pseudo classes, or geez, Cascade layers, anything else that we have to, like create additional specificity without relying on the nuclear option of
Right.
important.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the
And
other thing that we
yeah,
might have to rethink is using specificity that broadly. Um, Specificity is really just one little slice of the cascade. It's the slice that we deal with the most often, but it's just that one little thing. And really, we're talking about often we say specificity and we mean cascade priority. We mean where do things fall in the cascade. And specificity is just our entryway to that. But yeah, it's just one little piece. And then, origins and importance and shadow DOM context and cascade layers, these are all separate things. And specificity plays that little role. But then we're talking about overall, all of it together. What is the cascade priority of a declaration?
I could easily talk about this stuff all day long, because like
Same.
this yeah. Well, geez, we'll just kick everyone else out and just hang out here
Great.
for all day.
Yeah, Jaron, you can
No,
turn
but
your camera off again.
Yeah, no, no, I'm not
I
going.
know I
I'm
saw
not going
my
to.
boss here.
Even though I was obviously enjoying the conversation very, very much, I did have one question in mind. With all that knowledge about CSS and how it is and why it is, do you know anyone better, Jeff, than Miriam to actually maybe do a workshop?
No, I've learned so much from him over the years. Miriam and I used to work together at CSS Tricks, and like at the time, I think it was around the end of life of Susie, or your like
Uh-huh.
layout utility, which I used all the time. Everyone used all the time. And so just about layout and positioning and display, like in general, I learned so much from you. And so I
Oh,
can't
thanks.
imagine a better person to talk about it.
Nice. I mean, I was kind of using this as a little hook to showcase that the fact that we actually have there's two workshops with you coming up, right, Miriam?
Yeah.
One in autumn and one in spring, right?
Yeah, we're doing one with Smashing in October that will cover the cascade in depth and then also layout, and then one in April that is more focused just on layout.
Okay, cool. And
And
people can find out more information about that in an upcoming email, which they might get from me.
Great.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. That's fantastic. I want to thank you so much for your time and your input, Jeff, for your questions. Obviously, if you want to keep on going, feel free. Unfortunately, I have to leave, but I'll keep the session open. So if you want to keep on going, that's absolutely fine. And for everyone else, thanks so much for joining in. We've got a couple more smashing hours coming up in the next month, and then over the summer we do a little bit of a break, but after summer we're back with more smashing meets, more smashing hours, and 3 in-person or 3 hybrid conferences. So check it out, and all that rest for me is lots of love to you all, and hope to see you all soon.